Welcome to this special edition of Your Week with St. Luke's. We are talking about the vision and St. Luke's history, and we are so excited because we are joined today by two amazing people that everyone loves: our founding pastor of St. Luke's, Reverend Jim Harnish, and the second lead pastor of St. Luke's for, I think, the longest period of lead pastorship, Reverend Dr. Bill Barnes. I just made that word up, but that's all right. We can do that when we're doing podcasts. So welcome, gentlemen. I'm glad you've joined us today.
Great to be with you, Jen.
Yeah, Jen.
So tell us, first of all, Jim, how long were you appointed to St. Luke's? What years?
I came in 79 and we left in 92, which added up to 13 years.
Wow. And Bill?
I followed Jim in 92, and I think I retired in 2015.
So I want to talk, I've been looking up a lot of the history. I did that for the very beginning of the Vision series, 23andMe, at the beginning of the year, to kind of set in who we are and where we're going. And as we reveal the vision that the congregation created in February, I want to kind of go back to sort of some foundational things. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was the land was actually purchased like 20 years before you were appointed, Jim.
You know, I didn't realize it had been that far back until I read your information. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. When you imagine that there was nothing but orange groves out there at that time. I thought it had been purchased more like 10 or 15 years before we got there.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, when I saw that, before I ever came to St. Luke's, back in like 70, probably about 71, I was at Emory in undergraduate, and we were visiting all the incoming freshmen. And there was this one guy who lived in Windermere. So I came from St. Pete over, got off I-4, and thought I was like in the middle of absolute nowhere. And his little house, it's a little 2-bedroom, 1-bath house. It looks like it's still right on the lake when you go into Windermere. I know right where I visited him. But I remember that long trip through all the orange groves to this little house in Windermere, which Windermere then was just, fish camp houses, and all the way back to St. Pete. And I thought, how did that guy ever find Emory?
That's amazing. So what was the impetus for you to be appointed here, Jim?
That's a great question. I noticed the call came. I had never even heard of Windermere. I had to look it up on the map. And at any rate, the district had determined that it was time to move ahead. There had been a sign on the property for a long time, but no action. And then that fall of 78 was when the district committee decided it was time to move and do something. And they did this door-to-door knocking on doors out there, so that when I got there, there was already Phil Torrance, marvelous retired guy, had started services. There were about a dozen folks. And then I had this pile of cards, most of which, as I started following up on, people had clearly said, put my name down, goodbye. And they were gone. But out of that pile of cards came people like Neil and Bonnie James, and Linda and Charlie were there at the very beginning. And others that a couple of them that were here and then moved away. Anyway, that's what started. So
I remember when Jim started. I really didn't know Jim, but I don't know whether the church had gone into a lull about new church planting or what, but his work in Windermere was getting a lot of coverage in the conference. They showed this picture of him preaching on the back of a back of a fire engine and firehouse. And there's a lot of excitement about this new church start. I remember that for sure.
Which was actually just a heavy load of pressure. Gene West, the DS, kept saying, that church, it's going to go, it's going to yeah. And when it wasn't growing and the numbers were just this little handful of folk, suddenly people from the district telling me how great this church was going to be was not exactly encouraging. It was like water to a drowning man.
I had the same experience when the bishop sent me to First Methodist downtown Miami, and that had in the 80s, Miami in the 80s, imagine. And it was on the cover of Time magazine with a picture of the skyline. It said Miami, Paradise Lost. So I heard the same thing. Oh, you're going to go down there and the church is going to grow like crazy. And, just wait till you see what happens in downtown Miami. And then it didn't. Yeah. Same like you, Jim.
Yeah, it took a while.
Yeah.
So when, we've talked about this before, the three of us, kind of the St. Luke's DNA and really what your team, because of course, when I say you in this conversation, it's always plural because both of you are collaborative and it's really been lay ministry driven, I think, since lay people were a part of it. But what did you start? I mean, you were the first person, Jim. So like, what was your kind of like, we need to start a church that is reflective of, based in, and what were those key things that you and those first 99 people thought?
Yeah. And I've gone back and thought about that. One of it clearly was I came with a very clear conviction that just transferring Methodists from one congregation to another was no net growth for the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
And that we were primarily here to reach people who were unchurched. I mean, that was the term that we used back there in church growth circles, but that we were here to reach people who didn't yet know Christ or who had some Christian experience in their past, but that were outside the church. And so that was really the heart of. Now we would take anybody. So if people wanted to transfer, we were going to take them. But we were really out trying to look for people that were not engaged anywhere in the church. And I will say, since you underscore in the material the way the culture has changed, I'm deeply aware in the whole of ministry that Bill and I came into ministry when there was still the residual, the Christian sort of culture or the church culture. So out there in the neighborhoods where I started knocking on doors, which you wouldn't do these days either, but as I went out knocking door to door, there were people out there who, sure, I've heard of the Methodist Church, or that were looking for a church or had a positive experience. The church had a different role. And I never had any question that this was going to be a United Methodist Church, period.
Right.
So I wasn't inviting people to some vague Christianity. I was saying, would you like to be a part of a new United Methodist Church? And so I think that's in there.
Well, I'm going to help answer Jim's question on his behalf from what I found when I came. Jim used to joke that St. Luke's did open door evangelism. They opened the door and there were all the people waiting to come in. That is self-deprecating humor because that just doesn't happen. Right. I know it didn't just happen that people were thronging the doors to get in. The fact that we both served the majority of our ministry during a great time of boomers returning and that kind of thing, in some ways, it was the case, of course, in Christmas Eve and Easter. but it had to be what Jim was communicating, that this church was going to be, that people came. And I think one of the things that always impresses me, that I used to always take people to see, was when they built that sanctuary multi-use building and
Yep.
put the cross outside the window. That is so significant, but because it communicates our work is outside of this building. You know, I always said that St. Luke's was a warehouse for ministry. It's and I had to start saying that because there was so much junk in the hallways all the time. So I had to say something that gave my OCD some comfort. But we really are a warehouse for ministry. Our work is in the world. The people we want to reach are in the world. The kind of transformational ministry we want to do is in the world. It's always outside the window. And when a church starts by putting its cross outside where you can see it, it even if it isn't called to mind all the time, it's imprinting in the mind of the believers they worship that we need to be there, not just here.
Right. It was such a reflection that we still, I mean, I have it, you know, Bill, 2007, 8, I guess it was 2008 before the housing crisis, when we walked church council out there and we were like, okay, this is our roots, this is our heritage. We're going to go through this crisis and we're going to be there to help people. We're going to spend all our money helping people. And it was pivotal.
I think one of the things that's been great about the three of us as leaders is it's not always the case in the United Methodist Church that a new leader comes and values the past, affirms it, builds on it, is comfortable enough in his own skin to say, wow, we owe this to whoever came before us. And part of the consistency of who we've been as a congregation has been that we have always tried to build on what we had started. So there's a continuum, and there's not this horrible change that churches go through where they switch back and forth and they lose who they are and they lose people. You know, so I think that's a gift that Jim gave us in the beginning.
Yeah.
But I would say it's a gift that we keep giving him and others as we go back to value it.
Right. Jim Atchison, one of our leaders here, always says every time we do a new vision, a strategic vision, it's an evolution, not a revolution, because we want it to be an evolution of who we are, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you all, because we could go through the history and talk about, you know, how fast the church grew attendance wise, or buildings that we built and things like that. But there are pivotal, just DNA grounded things that you all did that I think speak into who we are and what we're trying to do today, as Bill talked about. Like, for instance, one of the things that Jim, I was looking at the history. I mean, you had Reverend Peter Story, you had Supreme Court Justice Blackmun come. I mean, you picked people to be in the pulpit that were speaking to what was going on in the world. Why? And tell me what the reaction was to those speakers that you had, or those guest people that you had.
Well, of course, that was later down the road too.
Right.
I think it's a great question. I think part of it was, if we're going to reach these people who are not inside the church, what's going on out there? How are we in touch with them? And when you said that, really a small but significant pivotal moment was early on when the Dr. Phillips Elementary was the only elementary school in the area, serving Bay Hill, Sand Lake Hills, Orange Tree, that area. Pretty comfortable place. And the school district wanted to bus kids from Tangelo Park into that school, which is a totally different demographic.
Right.
And the neighborhood was very tense about that whole thing. And I don't remember that we as a church sort of outwardly spoke directly to it. Well, yes, I did. I mean, I'm sure that I mentioned it in a sermon about being more broadly inclusive, because as much as I fully love and felt comfortable for the most part in the culture in which we were based, there were parts of me that were always a little uncomfortable with it.
Mm.
And that was a test case. What these kids coming from Tangelo Park. I mean, there were folks in the neighborhood who tried to get the school board to stop that and not do that. And I think that was an important place for us in the church. We said, this is okay. In fact, one of those guys was a friend of my daughter's, now a Broadway star.
Wayne Brady?
Wayne Brady, yeah. One of those kids was Wayne Brady.
Wow.
So I think there were small moments along the way
Mhm.
that said, yeah, we're going to be this way, not this way.
What was that like for you to
Me?
make this? Yeah, for you. You said you were uncomfortable. Like, talk about that.
I like people to like me.
It's the curse of pastoral ministry.
I know.
Mhm.
I remember some uncomfortable conversations,
Mhm.
but by the, we were still pretty small at that time.
Mhm.
So there was a pretty common sense of spirit for the most part. But it just seemed like the right thing to do.
I think that's too, because you were so grounded. You all were so grounded in our Wesleyan heritage. This is who we are: personal holiness, social holiness, St. Luke's, the Gospel of Luke, and who it was, and that whole idea that we're here for the people who aren't here yet.
Mhm.
And I think that's so pivotal. If you look, you started a family resource center, you started arts and innovation and worship because there were arts people that needed to be reached. And what is the creative ways to do that? But then also, yes, in social justice ways, there are things going on around us in the culture, and the church has a place in it. And that doesn't always mean, as I've talked to some people, poking people in the eye, but moving people towards more gospel living, more kingdom of God living.
Mhm.
Bill, what was that for you? What were some of those pivotal moments for you?
Well, let's say both Jim and I didn't want to move in 1992. He wanted to stay at St. Luke's. I wanted to stay at First Church Miami. Now, he'd been longer, 13 years. I was in my 7th year, and that's about just a time where there's a pivotal time in 7 years. But because of the lack of many churches with faith groups in downtown Miami, I had sort of a high profile. But my ministry experience had been inner city church in Atlanta, and then Miami under challenging situations where we had lots of great ideas in terms of social ministry, but no money. I saw what could happen at St. Luke's, where you connected people with not only economic resources, but voices that spoke to power or had a voice already at a table of decision makers. When you could connect that with social need or some kind of systemic change. That's actually how I got Lynette Fields to come. I couldn't, Lynette was dead set. She wasn't going to come to a wealthy suburban congregation. That wasn't where her head was. And I had to say, Lynette, think what you could do with money and power. So that's a real key, I think, to what we've been able to do, because we didn't allow people to be settled in complacency of their place,
Right.
So I've always been one who looked at ministry as gap filling. I think all three of us do.
Yeah.
Let's look at a place where people are falling through whatever it is and try to do some catching and lifting and changing.
Mm-hmm. So there's question in the history timeline, and Bill brought this up in an email, and I was questioning too. There was an AIDS awareness clinic that was held, or workshop that was held. Was that with you, Jim? Or was that in the midst of the transition? Because that then led to Serenades and working with Centaur and working with the Howard Phillips Foundation. And
I was coming out of Miami where um there were all these theories about how it was transmitted, who got it, and it landed on the Haitian community in Belle Glade, in central South Florida. And so where there was so much fear and worry, First Methodist, we went to Belle Glade and engaged with the Methodist churches didn't want us there. They weren't actually happy that we'd come, but we did engage with some AIDS work among what seemed to be at the time the population that was most affected. So I had that already in my heart when I came, and that was related, obviously, not just to the illness that was a pandemic in nature, especially through Africa, but specifically with the gay community. And so that took gaps and made them wider, because there was just a gap of non majority sexuality, but then you also had this fear of the disease itself. And so we found, of course, there's such a growing gay population anyway in Central Florida, especially because of our entertainment community and the people who end up there. And so it just seemed like something that we needed to address. And I sort of felt myself very much compelled to be a voice for that in the community. And we wanted to be not only somewhat of a prophetic voice, but also a healing voice, which is what Serenades was doing, was supporting, the organization that was really, Centaur was really reaching out to people. And, surprisingly, there was really not a lot of pushback from St. Lukers. I think it's because, there's a couple of ways you can affect change. One is the prophetic way, which it has its own power, but leaves a lot of people, winners and losers, or just in or out. And there's the pastoral way, and of course, that's my way, because I'm a people pleaser like Jim. And it takes longer, but you can move a whole congregation. The one thing I remember is the gay rights ordinance. I was the the only mainline pastor that was supporting it. And I was interviewed by the Orlando Sentinel, and I said, "Now, is there going to be anybody else in this article?" Oh yeah. Well, the article came out on a Sunday morning, and I was the only one. So I was like the lone voice out there. And so there was some stuff, but luckily it was just the beginning days of email. So I got this one email from a church member who said, "You have embarrassed me for my church." And I took the time to write back and explain why this was a part of who we were, and I got an answer back that said, I'm no longer embarrassed, I'm humbled."
Wow.
So I think that being very clear about how what you do is related to the gospel and to the life of Christ and the witness we need to make, it makes it difficult for people to not really look seriously at who they are and how they view their discipleship, and not land in some places that are uncomfortable for them, but necessary.
So let's talk about go ahead, Jim. Go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, the other thing that occurs to me there is it is all about location. And I used to say I had really clear answers on all of the questions around sexuality until I started meeting people who were, and that happened at St. Luke's. I mean, I would say to folks, you can't be hanging around the Disney and not get to know a bunch of gay people.
Right.
And the relationships And so I think the location is critically important. And that is, I mean, I really loved the location.
Right.
So did you? I mean, I had no problem just loving being there and being connected to the parks. And I wasn't quite as comfortable being connected to what was then Martin Marietta building. I don't know what all they built down there, but I received those folks into the church. But I loved that location, and I think people knew that.
Yeah,
And
I want to. Jim needs to go back to that. I didn't have to deal with any of that. He'd taken care of that by the time I got there. But during the Iraq War, and Jim, you made some very courageous statements and preached some very powerful sermons about that. So I understand from the people who didn't like them, who told me about them when I came.
Talk about that, Jim. Yeah. What does it mean to be that voice in this area that is sort of the trifecta of both entertainment, but also kind of this military, support system and tourism? It's a very, very interesting location to live and to do ministry in. So what was that like?
I mean, yes, I think we all agree. Fundamentally, it is. I want those folks to know that I love them, or that I'm doing my best to love them. I may disagree, but I'm going to try to respect and love you. But that one, yeah. When Jenn, you said plural you, I have been doing some personal growth and thinking about peace and nonviolence, and really moving in the direction of pacifism, although I can't be purely that, but moving that. I've been reading, and I gathered together a bunch of folks who were hungry pacifists. I mean, Chris Crotty was in that group, and Wells, and Bill and Carmen Cunningham, and there were, I don't know, 8 or 9 of us maybe that started reading books on nonviolence, and that was already going on when the war happened. And how would we respond? And that group put together a prayer service the night that they
it was the Gulf War, wasn't it? I was I said it was the Gulf War.
The Gulf War. They called it shock and awe.
Right.
And we had this really beautiful evening worship. And then I did preach as clearly as I could. But it was the group that sustained that. Yeah, that was decisive. And you always have people who leave you in moments like that. That's what happened at Hyde Park after 9/11. The Sunday after 9/11, we had Easter morning attendance, and the next week, not so much.
Well, what I always used to tell people is, even though I was gentle in my admonitions and my challenges, I think, it would upset people, of course. And I would say, I don't want you to get out of your car with your stomach in a knot, worrying about what you're going to hear when you come in. You need to find a place where you can enter joyfully. But the second part of that is, if you're willing to stay with your discomfort, you just might find that Christ is speaking to you in a way you hadn't expected. Not that I'm the voice of Christ, but
Right.
That's good.
Well, and it's interesting because when you look at things, when you look back, do you ever look back and go, man, gosh, we should have done this, or we should have said this, or is there any, maybe regret's not a part? I don't like the word regret, because you do the best, as Bill taught me, you do the best and make the best decisions with the information you have at the time.
That's right.
Which has been a healing thing for me to learn.
That's right.
I totally agree with that. We did the best that we knew how to do in that moment.
Mhm.
And partly this might reflect on what I said earlier about the moment in the culture, that people were willing to join the church.
Mhm.
And it was later when I was at Hyde Park that we got much more serious about making disciples.
Yeah, right.
And I would say that in across the years, I did a really good job of making a lot of church members.
Interesting.
Where I can name people that, looking back now, if I had it to do over again, I could wish that I had moved them into a deeper place of discipleship. I think we all have that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
There,
yeah.
there's been that big shift, really,
Mhm.
for me, ever since the General Conference made the mission of the church making disciples for
Right.
the mission of the world. And we got serious about that at Hyde Park. That that I said, yeah, wow, this, uh, I kind of wish I had been where I am now back
Mhm.
then. But you can't go back, and we
No.
were doing the very best that we knew how to do at the time.
Right.
Yeah, there's some uh, um, churches that are driven by their numbers. They want to see that on the statistical report at conference. Um, we had Linda Shanko in the membership office who took no prisoners. We had clean rolls. But I never was interested in, even though the numbers kept rising, I was never interested in that. In fact, there was a time, Jen, you were here then, when we decided how we were going to measure our effectiveness as a congregation.
Mhm.
We said we weren't going to count attendance or Sunday school attendance or a budget or anything like that. We were going to measure how many people were in hands-on service
Yep.
in the community beyond the church. And
Yep.
so being an usher or doing something that focused on internally, that didn't count. It had to be what you were doing. Now, people had to self-report, and I don't know ever we did it very well, but our goal, I remember, our average attendance was about 2,000 at the time, and we wanted to get 50% of our average attendance to be able to be documented as serving beyond the church. So if it never really worked over time, at least we were communicating.
Right.
That's what we need to measure, not
Right.
your sitting in a pew.
Right. And we're talking about now, and our commitment is go lead your life as public theologians. Like, you are the theologian in the public square in your life, which means you have to know your theology, you have to know your discipleship, you have to understand that relationship, but then use it in your marketplace, wherever your marketplace is, your public square, to make that difference. And I think people are starting to kind of hear that and understand it as we're, listening to people that are making just incredible impact in their workplace and in the neighborhoods and in the community.
Well, we're living in the greatest shift in the church since the printing press, I
Yep.
believe.
I
Right?
agree.
Everything changed after the printing press. Everything's going to change after this. And not that we anticipated this as well, but Jim was always one who engaged lay people in significant theological growth and study and thought and reflection and action.
Yes. Yes.
So we've continued to build on that, Jim. I was finally able to get Candler to see the wisdom of streaming for adult theological education. And in fact, it was funny. I was at a meeting up at Candler, I think a couple of years ago before COVID, and Dean Love said, well, we're doing the Candler Foundry now, which is doing all these courses. She said, it's something Bill Barnes has been trying to get us to do for 30 years.
Right.
Well, it wasn't exactly 30 years, but I know it was 20 years that I just kept after them. I said, we have lay people in the church who need, desire, deeply focused theological education. They don't want Sunday school type Noah and the flood. And so St. Luke's pioneered that with Candler. We were their test market, and now they have a full blown program, but that's going to be the key to people who aren't pew sitters engaging in theological education and challenge. And I'm really grateful that we did that. But even that, that carries my name on it. But it goes back to the culture, Jim, that you established when you just referenced your pacifism group.
Absolutely. Yep.
That's part of our DNA that's been developing and changing with the times and technology.
Well, and even just, we started this conversation talking about Peter Story coming in and Chief Justice Blackmun coming in, and then Candler and seminary training. And we just had Theo Ed, where we had, top speakers of theology and progressive theology come in and speak because of those connections. And so it wasn't anything new. Because it was embedded in who we have been from the very beginning, to have provocative, challenging, like, where are we learning, but also this understanding that when I listen to this person, it's affecting my discipleship. It's growing me as a disciple of Jesus Christ.
Our worldwide connection with Belfast and Cuba and all those places that Jim was not one to say, okay, his taking people to South Africa,
right,
and exposing them to issues of apartheid and church faithfulness and prophetic witness and all. I'll let you head off that way. You're probably going that way anyway. But
so Jim, how did you decide to take people to South? Talk to me about that whole movement. Because again, what we're doing now is so rooted in some of that work that you did. Talk about that.
Sure, because it was formative for me. I went to the World Methodist Conference in Nairobi in '86, and it was a transformational experience. And I've since found out it was for a whole lot of other folks too. And Desmond Tutu spoke at that event, and I certainly remember him, but that's where I first heard Peter, and was just deeply moved and really drawn into, and this was in the height of the struggle, coming down toward the end, but in hard times. So I was really impressed and moved. And then fortunately, I was dean of the pastor's school the next year, which meant I had some money to work with. So I could bring Peter over. And that's why he was first time at St. Luke's was to be a pastor's school. Thank you, annual conference. And then that's, I want to go back. And he invited me to come over to preach at Central in Joburg while he was in the States next summer. And I said, why should I go by myself? And so I picked up a few folks to go, and it was powerful. And that's how that whole connection started. And then it grew and other folks got involved. So I think, and Bill has done that, you've done that, Jen. I think the engagement with people, I mean, parenthetically, I like working with strong people. I'm aware that some preachers are afraid of them. And I've really come to appreciate people who have energy and strength and talent that I don't have, and to learn from them. I learned everything I know about being a senior pastor as a staff leader from Bob McKinnon, and I chose people to chair the staff parish committee at St. Luke's who were top leaders.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of an engagement, it transforms us all, and it like leaven in the loaf. Yeah, I may have wandered a little bit there.
No, I think
that was very good.
Because I think that's the DNA again of who we are today still. I mean, I think the work and the looking at the global issues and bringing them back home. I mean, that's what you did with Gary Mason and Belfast. helping us understand peace and reconciliation through that work. That was just how did that get started? Because the Gary Mason story is really interesting. It was kind of you and Lynette came to you and.
Well, it was, you know, Jim knows, Jenn too. When anybody comes to the conference and they need to raise money for something, they're going to send them to St. Luke's because they think we got deep pockets. And so I call it traveling for dollars. So Gary had met Ann Burkholder somehow at Candler. I don't even know whether she was at Candler at that point, but anyway, Ann Burkholder put together a little trip for him and made St. Luke's one of his stops. So he was there on a Sunday night and he spoke. And I guess we had about 50 people who listened to him. I didn't know him, but I went, of course. And then he invited me and three other clergy to come be his guests in Northern Ireland for a week in January of all times. And there was still, they hadn't had the Good Friday Peace Accord. I was there for that later on, but it was still, a place where bombs went off. And I was just so, funny thing is that the last day there, I went to his office and I thought, and Jim knows this, too, Jenn, you get there now, the light's going to come on you and they're going to ask you for the big money, So before he started asking for money, I went, oh, whoa, wait, Gary, and I played that thing, like, we don't have all this money. I don't know, it's not in the budget, that kind of thing. And he goes, no, Bill. He said, I'm not interested in your money. Lie. But he said, I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in develop a long-term relationship. And little did we know that the long-term relationship will not only involve several congregations, but a personal relationship with Gary and me and our families that is a rich one, whereas his children are like our own. But it was really simply, find a place where Gary can go and maybe get some money. Maybe he can score $500 at St. Luke's.
So it's interesting if you look at the work of, and it's easy for me to look back and see that what we're doing has these connections. Because if I look at the work that you just talked about with South Africa, with Belfast, then you come to 2020 and you come to this, really racial reconciliation moment in the United States with George Floyd. You can't help but walk into that, not only because it's a biblical issue of justice, but because that's who we've been. I mean, everything that we've learned and taught from other people around the world have taught us that in this moment we have to speak, and in this moment we have to wade into this and be a voice. So as you're looking at things that have happened, maybe since your ministry or as you've watched St. Luke's, how do you look back and go, they're doing this because we did this? Do you see any of that? Well, ripple effects is what we're talking about.
I'm going to go first since I'm closest to your ministry in terms of chronology. So Jim would appreciate this because he comes out of a theater background. I mean, I don't think there's any Shakespearean work he hasn't quoted in a sermon.
I know, it's pretty remarkable. I'm really jealous.
It is absolutely remarkable. But at any rate, that is not, I was a business major. It was not my strong suit at all. I did know the nasty parts of Canterbury Tales though. But when Jenn started visioning theater ministry, I thought, well, okay, I didn't stop anything, but it was just like, how's that going to work? But as it was connected to the gaps in people's lives, as she stated very clearly, in the early years, I remember at least it was 50% of the people in the production have to be non-St. Lukers.
Still is.
Yes, actually more sometimes. And then maybe, I don't know whether you know this, Jim, but then it came to the idea that very early on, she would go to rehearsals and talk to the cast about why this particular production aligned with our values, which were kingdom values. And then coming out of it, preaching on the themes that were in the production. So it wasn't just community theater for the sake of community theater. It was theological education. It was evangelism. It was prophetic statement in a way that people could receive a prophetic statement. And some of the things that were dealt with, well, the first one was hairspray. So there right away, you're dealing with, you know, some issues of human expression.
Right.
And then ragtime, dealing with issues of racial oppression and segregation. And so the themes that were chosen for those productions directly connected back to South Africa, you know, connected to LGBT support, and they still do. That is a tremendous success. St. Luke's is known for it now, the quality,
Right.
the message.
Yeah. I'm glad you used the word quality, because I think that is what sets it apart, is that people in town know that it's really good theater. It isn't just sort of thrown together. So yeah, amazing stuff.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's the excellence too that has always been a thread through here. Excellence, not to the point of perfectionism, but excellence as in, you know, we're going to put our best foot forward because God calls us towards that, calls us towards quality so that people can relate to it and understand it. So any other ripple effects that you go, man, I'm really proud that I was a part of that we created that ripple in our Central Florida community.
Well, you know what I'm going to say. I'm really grateful that the congregation helped me start Shepherd's Hope.
Absolutely.
I had to have my blood drawn yesterday for my annual physical, and it was at the Walgreens, the LabCorp Walgreens across the street from the church. And just conversation, the woman said, "So what do you do?" I said, "I'm retired." She said, "What do you retire from?" I said, "Well, you know, the church across the street. I was the pastor there for a long time." Oh, she said, and she said, "That would be wonderful work." And I said, "Well, you know what? I think my most wonderful work was founding Shepherd's Hope."
Yeah.
She started to weep.
Oh my gosh.
Back before she had any insurance, she was an African-American single mother with 2 children. She had insurance for her children, but she didn't have insurance for herself. And she went to Shepherd's Hope, and she had a lump in her breast, and they treated her. They got her to Orlando Health, you know, just saved her life. And she's just crying about it, you know. But 200 people helped me bring a vision of that to reality. And now there's been more than 330,000 patients for free that have been seen. But as I said to her, as I always say, you know, I don't care about 330,000 people. I care about you, the one person. Did you come in the door? Did they receive you with dignity? Was your name important? Did you get quality care? Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. I said, well, that's what we want. It's not all the people. It's one by one, which is back to the start, 99, one by one. It's up to Jenn. When you have that one person who comes in and says, I was estranged from my church, I was rejected from my church, and now you've received me and I find a place. It's always just that one person that I come back to, for whom something like that, to be loving, to be cared for, you can't put a price on it. You just can't put a price on it.
It's true.
Yeah. Oh, how can we improve on that? I mean, that it does point deeply to the way the Spirit works in these very human, very imperfect lives of ours.
Yeah.
And I look back over all of these years now in just amazement, just amazed really with where that journey has gone, and grateful for the consistent stream um, that keeps flowing along. When I read through your material, which really is pretty amazing. Bill and I never put together a document like that, and I was, really, really inspired, challenged. It's a lot, and BHAGs, big audacious, what is it? Big hairy audacious goals.
Yep.
Which I really appreciate, but that at the center, not but, and at the center is still clarity about we are here as followers of Christ to invite other people to come into the love of Christ, to make that reality in their life. That's really, I pulled out, thinking about this, the program from the charter service.
Right.
Because I almost remembered this, but as a mission statement, this is way too long. It's too wordy. We didn't know what we were doing, but it's not bad. St. Luke's is a community of Christians. Community is a key word. Seeking to answer Christ's call to discipleship and bring wholeness to persons and relationships through the celebration of worship. I mean, there is a hunger for tradition. St. Luke's can offer that along with all the contemporary great, praise God, and at the same time, the resources to really maintain the strength of our worship tradition, which continues to be vital there. Okay, celebration of worship by fostering growth in the knowledge of Christ and Christian teaching, and y'all are certainly doing that. By providing for and strengthening Christian fellowship, check. By affirming and encouraging the talents and gifts of persons, check. Talk about encouraging gifts, man. By responding to human need wherever it may be, check. By sharing and demonstrating the love of God revealed in Christ, check. And by being a model of ethical responsibility in a world of increasing scarcity.
Ooh.
Check.
Jazz hands.
We were in the midst of the Carter energy crisis. We were really, and in fact, little known fact, remembered fact, when Neil Schweizer did the master plan for the first unit, it was supposedly designed that we could pick up the prevailing breezes coming from one end. The breeze would flow down through the center under that skylight, and then you could open up the windows. I assume the fans might still be there. There were big fans on either side of the chancel in those closets.
Yeah.
It was in the cooler months of the year, we could use the natural breeze and save on all that electricity that we were burning up. Well, we tried that a time or two. It didn't work, but it was a noble effort, and that's what that increasing scarcity was. So anyway,
to talk about DNA and its life cycle through St. Luke's, that decision by Neil Schweizer, who, by the way, was a protege of Frank Lloyd Wright and had finished buildings at Florida Southern. Nils had that idea that Jim told me about. That's the reason why the entire campus sits on an angle on Apopka Island, because that building went at that angle to catch the breeze. So then, everything else was related to that angular. And then when we came to build C building, we had a big decision. Were we going to put C building straight facing Apopka Island and have this other funny thing, or would we just align it with Neil Schweizer's great idea? And that's why the whole campus sits on an angle, because of that idea that was rooted in faithfulness to energy use.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
And it does make it a unique place. I mean, I've often thought if we built that first unit just sitting there looking out on the road the way you would expect, how boring would that be?
Right.
And everything is off at an angle.
And the reason there's same idea was because of the pristine lakes, you know, and Windermere had the dirt streets, that when they did the parking lot at St. Luke's, there was going to be no long pieces of asphalt so that the rainwater could be not run off into the lakes at some point, but percolate into the ground. So we've allowed people to complain about dirt and mud for 40, how many years it's been, you know?
Right.
I've had people come in to me, Jim probably had them too, you know, you have a nice, what you think is a pretty effective sermon, and someone goes out and says, if you don't do something about the dirt in the parking lot for my shoes, I'm never coming back. You know?
And that legacy continues. No.
But
I will.
We couldn't afford to pave anything. That was the other thing.
We couldn't afford to pave it.
No money.
Same. When you have to look at that, that's another good point. You look at how much it would cost to pave everything around the church, increase the retention to do that, to what you could do with that very same money.
Yes.
East Winter Garden, helping to raise
Right.
people in poverty, or empowering the family groups in Zoe. I mean, it's always been a no-brainer for us, hasn't it? Really.
So I will, and this, we'll probably put this in another section. This is wonderful conversation, because in our vision meeting, as we took all the survey responses and everything, it was our young people, predominantly. I'm going to give a shout out to our director of missions, Sonia Kazan, who grew up in this church and only knows this church, who was like, if you're going to reach my generation, you've got to, environmental responsibility has to be labeled and named in this vision. And she's the one that's getting us 2,000 petitions for clean water. She's the one that has worked with some of our other young people that are in business. And we're going to be talking about this more, but to talk about how to begin to use solar power, but not just solar power, but create endowments that would then help us to, once our solar power might be paid, to maybe do that with habitat. Anyway, there's lots of conversations happening, and it's so good to know that it is rooted in our history. Again, it's just who we've always been. And Sonia is going to be so proud of this conversation.
Well, and all the oak trees in the parking lot.
Right, right.
You know, Brooks Gilmore was really behind that, so that we kept the temperature down, you know, and created shade. So yeah.
So cool stuff that's going to happen. And it's nice to know that it started with you all, and it didn't start new. It's just an evolution of who God has been from the very beginning, and how St. Lukers have followed God's lead to reveal the kingdom of God and awaken disciples. So thanks, guys. It was good to talk to y'all.
Yep. Great to see you. Great.
Thank you. Great.
Bye-bye.